Today's Columbus Metropolitan Club Forum, You Don't Know Joe, is sponsored by the Robert Weiler Company and by Frost Brown Todd. Please join me in thanking them. Information, as if you needed it, about our speakers is in the forum flyer today, so I'll provide only a brief introduction. On the verge of retirement as provost and executive vice president of The Ohio State University, he accepted the position as interim president for the second time. Please welcome Joe Alutto.
In New York. I started school in New York City, and it was a great time to be in the public school system in New York, where if they identified you early, you skipped grades, you took advanced classes, all the things we talk about today as being desirable was going on in New York at the time. So I started high school in a high school with 4,500 kids, and then my parents decided to move out of New York City, and we moved to a small town where I entered a junior class in high school that had a total of 50 students in it. So the scale issue was very different. And that was very important because it gave me a chance to understand what it was like to live with large numbers of people where you really had to find your way, you had to be very aggressive, and then at the same time to live in an environment which is very personal, very social, where you really spent a lot of time knowing people in depth. That helped me as time went on. My parents were really very insistent that we try new things. They themselves were not very aggressive or risk-taking, but they insisted their two sons did. And the notion there was always to try something new, and failing was not a problem. Failing was just a part of the learning process. So there was never any concern on my part about trying anything different, approaching things in a different way. It's just a normal part of life and a normal part of living. So for me, as in leadership positions, that's always been an easy part of being a leader. My father was a truck driver, had a sixth grade education, but at the end of his career, he was supervising 200 men in a very large trucking company, watching this very shy individual, and that he was a very shy person, lead those individuals. You picked up tricks very quickly. One of the things you learned very quickly was that he paid most attention to what people did and not what they said. To him, that was really critical. People were held accountable. One of the best conversations I ever had with one of his drivers was he kept talking about Tough Tony and Tough Tony and Tough Tony, and I couldn't figure out who he was talking about, and I realized he was talking about my father. And I asked him what that meant. Why was it Tough Tony? He looked at me and he said, well, Tony will argue with the suits at headquarters or the union officials as long as he's given his word on something. And to me, that was a very important part of leadership and something I hope has always been characteristic of what I've done. So it's in all bits and pieces that's happened.
And like all of us, you know, our lives are brought together in a lot of different ways. And certainly this year has been a bit of a roller coaster for you. Here we are in August of 2013. You announced that you were stepping down from Ohio State as provost, maybe thinking that you were going to get to drive that English sports car a little bit more and relax a little bit more. And then I read in the paper that you're going to be the interim superintendent of Columbus City Schools, and I think that lasted for what, maybe 24 hours or something like that. And Dr. Gee threw you a curveball and said, hey, guess what, I'm retiring, and now you're interim president of Ohio State. Now, we read the version in the dispatch, but wow, I mean, there's been a lot going on. There had to be some amazing phone calls. Tell us about it.
Well, there were some very interesting conversations. The school system issue all came about because I was approached by some of the school board members and ultimately by the mayor and asked to think about it as a possibility. And the more I spent time looking at the school system and realizing how critical it was to the future of this society and to my family's future, and knowing how committed I've always been to public education. I served on a school board as a school board president for 5 years before I came to Columbus. It began to look more and more possible. There are really interesting things that can be done with our school district. I mean, it has incredible range of performance. There are schools in that district that are really among the best you're going to see in this nation. And there are schools in that district that are truly an embarrassment to this community. The question ultimately is, how do you bring all that together? How do you get a greater standard of performance? I was also very impressed, so you all know, I spent some time talking with the teachers union and with the operating personnel. They are ready for change. It was clear they were prepared to see major changes in the district. So between that and then the commission that was looking at the future of education, it looked like an interesting opportunity to come in and make some very significant changes that would be in the best interest of the community. So I managed to rev myself up and get excited about that, and then I got this phone call one evening that said, we really need you to stay here as interim president. And then the phone calls went back and forth, and the mayor was unbelievably gracious. I have an incredible admiration for Mike Coleman, and I have to tell you, he handled this one just extremely well, in which he said, there are tough choices. I'd love to have you in the school district, but we really understand why this is important for you to stay. So everyone has been wonderful about it. I appreciate the sensitivity that everyone has shown for this. I've been at Ohio State. I love Ohio State. I'm committed to Ohio State. I think this community ought to be similarly committed. But I have an interesting opportunity now as interim president to also help the school district. And I hope to see the university more actively involved in those changes that are going on now that are being contemplated. So they're not disconnects. They're all in very sense connected. And it's my job to find those connections.
It's all good.
It's all good.
We've read a lot. I was teasing you a little bit ago. You've got to be the most interviewed person in this community in the last 6 months. So it's a little bit of a challenge to know exactly what things we want to talk about today, but I do want to take a little time talking about your approach as interim president. In the paper this morning, 7,100 new freshmen, a record in terms of how many students have applied to Ohio State. It scares me a little bit. I'm not sure I would have gotten in, although who knows, probably a lot of us are alumni too. We're excited. What are some of your approaches? You get all these freshmen coming downtown Monday. What are you going to say to them?
Well, a couple of different pieces. Besides that 7,100 students that you're talking about, 258 new faculty joined us today. I met with them this morning. So it's an excitement on both ends, on the point of the students who are going to be here, but also the faculty who are joining Ohio State at a critical time in the development of this institution. My job is really very simple. I've said it from the very beginning. My job, as I said this morning to faculty, is simply to create an environment in which they can succeed. And the same presentation to students is my job is to create an environment in which they can do more than they ever thought possible. So at the very abstract, that's really all I'm doing as president. Now to do that, one of the things we want to do, make sure we do, is to continue to focus on attracting the very best students we can find, make it accessible to them, so keep our costs as low as possible, recruit those faculty we've talked about. We're going to do that heavily at Ohio State through the discovery themes and the focus we have in 3 major areas, and then bring them all together in programs. There's no sense in attracting bright students or bright faculty and keeping them separate. You really have to bring them together in a way that allows them to grow and to contribute, and that's really through our academic programs. So it's the ability to do that at both the graduate and undergraduate level that's really critical. And of course, what underlies all of that is really generating the financial resources that are necessary. So that's really what I'm going to be doing as interim president. I hope it's what any president would do. It's what's needed to keep Ohio State going. We have incredible momentum, which is not true if you travel around this country as I do, and you see what's happening at other public institutions where there's a pause, or there's a delay, or there's a postponement of plans. At Ohio State, we have been able to move aggressively because of the strategic planning that we've had and the resource base that we've had, the alumni who stepped forward, a governor who's been very, very supportive of higher education under very difficult times, a community like Columbus that has really allowed us to integrate with it. One of the comments I made to students today was they need to understand they're in an urban university. This is not a Big Ten university out in the middle of the countryside. This is a Big Ten university that's in a thriving urban environment in which there are things they can take advantage of they would never have access to if they were, in point of fact, out at Purdue or some other institution like that. They need to take advantage of it as part of the growth experience of being at Ohio State.
You were talking a little bit at lunch about the creative ways that Ohio State is using some of its financing. Would you share some of the things you told me in terms of how you're attracting faculty by giving them more of a guarantee than what maybe they get somewhere else?
Well, one of the difficulties that many universities are having, as all of you know, that increases in tuition have reached the point where it really is difficult for students to come, many of whom need access, are bright enough but don't have the economic wherewithal to come. So Ohio State's focused a lot of its attention on trying to contain those increases in tuition. As you know, for the last 5 years, I believe we've had no tuition increase at Ohio State, which I don't believe is something that's been duplicated anyplace else at any major institution. So we've been able to try to contain tuition levels, but if you do that, you lose the resources you need to grow. You don't have them through tuition increases. You don't have the resources you need to be innovative. And so what we've done at Ohio State is to sort of step back and say, well, what are the revenues you can generate other than through tuition and other than through the traditional research dollars that are generated? And that's where we issued, as you know, a century bond where we were able to borrow money at an incredibly low rate for 100 years and use that instead of tuition dollars. We leased our parking facilities. We essentially monetized an asset that had been sitting there unproductive in terms of generating resources. But rather than spend those dollars directly, what we've done is taken those dollars and put them into our endowment and managed it as an endowment for the university, which means the only thing we spend off it is the income that's received from the endowment. So we have a permanent financing base. And as a result, when we're talking to faculty members who are thinking about moving a research team to Ohio State or thinking about coming themselves, we can talk about faculty appointments with some certainty and some guarantee that this will occur on a long-term basis. That's not something that many universities can do, either because they're so dependent on tuitions alone, or they haven't thought about the issue of how do we go about aggressively increasing the endowments that we have.
One of the things that was in the paper this morning mentioned that 28% of the incoming freshman class are not from Ohio, and that the university is getting more aggressive about recruiting students from other states. And I mean, we've always been aggressive about, taking students from other countries. How does that play into Ohio State's mission as a land-grant university? Is there any conflict there? I mean, do we have a responsibility to educate Ohio's children first?
Well, we have a responsibility to provide access to excellence. And so, interesting question you have to ask yourself is, if you don't have a diverse student population, a diverse faculty, how are you going to get to that level of excellence that is so critical for the citizens of Ohio? Remember, every graduate we have, and everyone who doesn't come to Ohio State, is going to have to compete in a global environment. They're not going to compete in just an Ohio environment. They're not going to compete just in Columbus. They're going to be affected by what's going on in the world. So they have to be aware of it. They have to know how to deal with it. They have to be comfortable with it. And in our case, that means making sure not just that we bring students from out of state into Ohio, but also that we bring international students to Ohio so our students can live with them, work with them, understand them, and then, more importantly, to make sure our students have a chance to go overseas and get an opportunity to live outside the United States, to learn what it's like to develop and understand a different culture, to learn what it's like to acquire a new language, to learn what it's like to solve problems outside the comfort of being in a hometown. So it's really not just a question of having 28% of our students from outside of Ohio. It's really a question also of our sending our students outside the United States into other locales where they can develop those skills on a first-hand basis. That's the world they're going to be in. It may not have been the world that I was in. We have this event downtown on Monday, and one of the things they asked for was an old photograph. And so it just so happens I had an old yearbook from college, and that's the only old one I could find. It's this bizarre photograph. I had hair that was cut short for some reason. But it was interesting. I went to an all-males college, Manhattan College. There were 3 people of color in my graduating class. I had never realized it at the time, and it just happened because I opened that book, and that's not a real world. So it's really not a question of the exact number of students, whether they're from Michigan or they're from California or they're from China or India. It's really looking at that mix that's necessary from a growth perspective.
Well, talk a little bit more about globalization and what kinds of priorities do you and do the university have, and how is that going to lead Ohio State to what we all are aspiring to, eminence for the university? I know globalization is a big deal for you, and you've worked a lot with China and taught a lot in China. Tell us more about that, please.
Well, the question here really is, if we as a nation are going to be competitive, we need to be able to understand what's happening around the world. We need not worry about boundaries in the sense that there's no boundary limitation on knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge, and it crosses boundaries very easily, particularly these days. So the issue for us is, if we're going to be truly competitive, we need to know what that means. What's happening outside the United States? What does it look like? And within the United States, how do we present ourselves so we can take advantage of knowledge that's being generated outside the United States? I was at a meeting not very long ago with Jeff Wadsworth from Battelle, who was in China and was in their national academy and was visiting a couple of universities. Happened to walk into a university that had equipment that was more sophisticated than anything he had seen in the United States. And what struck him as a really odd situation was that he knew a number of universities were trying to develop the funding to think about buying that equipment. But it already existed and it was already being used. And we need to know that. We need to understand it. And you don't know it, you don't understand it, unless you get out of your office and you get out of the comfort of a local environment and actually go there, be there, meet with people, understand how they think. That's really what we mean by globalization. It has to be an integral part of the educational process, not something that's represented because we have a center. It really has to be part of the education of every student and the orientation of every faculty member.
Was that why you got so involved with Experience Columbus? I mean, it's kind of unusual for a provost of a university to be the president of the Travel and Tourism Bureau. When you did that, I kind of thought, oh, that's pretty cool. Is that all kind of connected in your mind?
Listen, the visitation activities of Experience Columbus and this community are absolutely essential to who we are and what we're an urban institution. We live in a vibrant city. Anything we can do to help the vibrancy of that institution, I think, is just very, very important to me. Experience Columbus is critical in helping us think through who we are as a city, what it is we want to bring forward. And interestingly enough, from my perspective, and one of the things that people tell me is I tend to be fairly pragmatic. Well, I look at visitors into the city of Columbus, and what I see are tax revenues to support social services that are not being provided by the citizens of Columbus. Every one of those visitors are paying taxes. They generate tax revenue to help support social services, a variety of activities that are critical to the quality of life in Columbus. And you know, we're not taxing our own citizens in the process. So for me, getting involved in that activity was just an extension of what I was doing at that time in the College of Business when it first started, and just the general commitment and involvement that leaders of Ohio State have always had to this community.
Well, and let's go back. You came here in 1991. Right. To run and to create, really, the whole Fisher complex there. Mm-hmm. What brought you here initially? I mean, you had a pretty good job where you were, what was it, State University of New York?
Right, at Buffalo.
Buffalo. What was it that attracted you here?
Really, that's a wonderfully complex question, interesting enough.
Good.
I had... Long and short of it is, Ohio State had tried to recruit me a couple of years prior to this, and I had not had any interest in coming to Ohio State. And the reasons were not complicated. The College of Business at Ohio State at that time had declined in terms of its quality for a number of years. And the president of Ohio State at that time was a wonderful man, Ed Jennings, had allowed that to happen. Well, if you have any smarts as a dean, you don't go to an institution where the president has allowed a unit to decline because it means it's not a priority and you're not going to succeed no matter how good you are. And so I said no, I wasn't going to come. In fact, my advice to the search committee was to wait until they had decided to do something about the college before doing a search. 2 years went by, they hadn't recruited a dean, and a different search committee that was constituted then came and contacted me again, and I expressed the same reservations that I had just expressed. And one of them on the search committee said, well, we've got a new president. And I said, that's okay, that's nice, I don't know anything about him. And they said, well, you'll learn. And so I then got a call from Gordon. And it was Gordon at his best. I mean, it was just, the world was, I could have whatever I want, I could do whatever I want. And,
I think there's some other folks out there who've heard that
conversation.
conversation.
Heard that conversation. But I had an unusual advantage. A faculty member, a woman who I had mentored for a number of years, happened to be an assistant of Gordon's when he was at Colorado. And so I called her and I said, who is this guy? I mean, he's just promising everything. Is he real? And she said, you know, he is. And if you give him a chance, it won't be as rosy as he says it is, but it will be good. And so I called Gordon back and said, look, I'm not sure I want to do this, and you need to understand that if I were to agree to come, it would be very disruptive because we'd have to really tear the college apart to make it better. We'd have to operate in a very different way. We'd have to treat it as a corporate turnaround in a very real sense. And Gordon said, well, why don't you come up and tell them that, let's see what they do. And so I did. I came up, and that's what I told the faculty. And they were wonderful. I mean, they sat there pretty much and said, you know, we hear you, we know it's going to be painful, but we really do care, we really do want to improve, so we're really interested, so would you come? And so I did. I came to Ohio State. Behind all that was a very important piece. I had been president of the the AACSB, which is the national accrediting body for business schools. So I had been to most major universities. And I couldn't find another public institution where a dean had as much autonomy as they did at Ohio State. It was one of the things that stood out about Ohio State. And so that autonomy was one of the reasons I came here. And it's one of the reasons that I've thrived and a number of other people thrived. When Gordon One left, everyone talked about a lot of the very public things that Gordon had done and how important that was in transforming Ohio State. I looked at it in a very different way. At the time I came here, there were 19 deans. When Gordon left, he had replaced 11 of us. I think of the 11 he replaced, 10 had come from outside of Ohio State. And every one of us who came from outside of Ohio State were amazed at the resource base that was available, the things you could do with the scale of Ohio State. Instead of thinking of it as a problem, to think about it as an advantage, something you could leverage. And it's that ability to come in with a totally different perspective that I think makes a huge difference. And it's one of the reasons why, over the last few years, virtually all of our deans have come in from outside of Ohio State with new perspectives, looking at what we have been doing in the past, but seeing it in a very different and usually very creative way. And it's one of the things that I think will continue as a tendency at Ohio State.
You know, there is so much we could talk about and so many things that I don't have very much time left here. I don't want to dwell on any of the negatives, but you've been here 22 years at Ohio State. It hasn't all been roses or rose bowls. It's been, you know, you've dealt with some really, really tough and sad and hard issues. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I don't want to dwell on the negative, but, you know, through the whole thing with Tattoo Gate and all of that, I really have to know, what was your first thought when you realized that Jim Tressel maybe knew a little more than what he had let on?
That was one of the most difficult times. I was part of the small group that had to talk to Jim about stepping down. And I have to tell you, I have incredible admiration for Jim Tressel. I knew him fairly well while he was here. I spent some time with him, working with him. I saw how he worked, not just in Columbus, but I saw how he worked with communities and the value system that was Jim's. And so it was incredibly tragic to me that a mistake had been made, and I think it was a mistake, and I think Jim even today will admit that he made a mistake. And then a sequence of events occurred that allowed it to get out of hand because it began to look as if there was a cover. And you know as well as I do, it's not the mistake that's the problem. It's always the attempt to cover up that becomes a problem. And so to me, yes, you're right, that was a tragic moment. But to me, the other part of that was the ability of Ohio State to face up to a very difficult decision, and one that isn't a legal decision. The legal part of that is simple. It's very straightforward. But the emotional part of dealing with someone who everyone loved, always exceptions, but pretty much everyone loved, everyone wanted to be helpful for, and you couldn't. There was just no way at that point that it could happen. So it was a difficult time, but it's part of the culture of the institution to face up to those issues, which I think is very important and very admirable at Ohio State.
And there's a resilience, isn't there, that, that is demonstrated when we as a community feel that pain and go through it as well. You're very, very successful, and you've stayed here, and certainly you've had opportunities and have been enticed to go other places. What has kept you here?
If you look at my career, it's not complicated. I've been at two institutions for extended periods of time. And my general philosophy is, as long as I'm having fun, as long as I'm contributing to the institution wants me, then why leave? Leaving has transaction costs. It's very simple. I've got a very, very special family situation. I have virtually all of my family here in Columbus now, with children and grandchildren. We have 14 grandchildren. 12 of them are here in the Columbus area. It's just a great community in which to live, and an incredible institution. So why go someplace else just for the sake of moving?
I have a couple more minutes. We're going to sneak in 2 more questions, and then it's going to be the audience's opportunity. So be thinking of some good questions for Joe. In each of our lives, there are moments in time when the clock stops and you get this indelible memory picture that stays with you forever. And maybe it's a time when, who knows, an oddball thing happens or whatever, and you realize this is where I'm supposed to be. Defining moments for you at Ohio State.
Well, let me give you two. One was when I asked Carol to marry me, and she said yes.
Yay!
And that's clearly the most important. But there's a second one which won't be familiar to most of you, and that was meeting Max Fisher. Max Fisher was a very special individual, and when I was thinking about coming to Ohio State, everyone kept telling me there's this donor who's going to solve all your problems. And I said to Gordon, before I decide whether I'm coming to Ohio State, I really need to meet this phantom. And so I flew down to Florida and I met Max, and it was the beginning of just an incredible relationship. It was close to, from my perspective, as a father-son as I've had in my life, in which he didn't want to talk about buildings. It was wonderful talking to him. It was all about programs. It was all about what was the content, what had to happen to the programs, what had to happen to the quality of the faculty and the student body to reach success. And so we spent 3 or 4 hours that first day talking, and then I spent the rest of my time while he was alive talking with him about what was happening at the college, and it was always about the programs, the students, and the faculty. It was never about the buildings, even though the buildings were just a wrapper, an enabling device. And it was so refreshing to meet someone who just focused on the substance of what we were doing and then how to do it. He had worked with 5 different presidents. Listening to him talk about the psychology of each president and trying to understand why they were behaving the way they were just reinforced the notion that if you're going to lead something, if you're going to make people achieve more than they thought they could, you need to know them and you need to know what they're about. So those are at least 2 examples.
Okay, well, let me sneak in one more then. Okay. So what do you think some of your greatest achievements, the things that you're most proud of, either with Fisher or as provost?
I have to tell you something. I don't identify any one thing that I'm particularly proud of. I spend my life, because I enjoy it, helping other people succeed. And so it gives me a unique pleasure. Unlike somebody who's totally self-centered, okay, then they have to worry about what they're doing all the time. And have they seen success? Have they seen it? My satisfaction really has come from seeing what's happened to those faculty who I've recruited. What's happened to the students when I run into them at various events nationally and internationally, and they talk about the success they've had. So it's a constant reinforcement of success rather than, well, was today a good day or a bad day? That's not what drives me. It's really, and I know it sounds trite, but it really is the thing that is the major source of satisfaction, is to watch what happens when you exert a little effort on behalf of other people. They succeed, they feel good, you feel good. It just makes life better.
When you meet with the 7,100 students, freshmen, coming in on Monday, what is it that you want them to know after that experience downtown that they maybe don't know walking into Nationwide Arena?
Well, I wanted to know that they're at a world-class university and they are in a city that is second to none. And that means they have all access to all the cultural activities that they'd ever want to see. It's here, and it's easy to take advantage. They actually have something called touted that they could use if they don't want to have a bike or a car. They can do sports, and it doesn't have to just be on campus. They can go to museums, they can go to the conservatory. It's just a variety of life, a quality of life that I believe many of them will have difficulty duplicating when they leave Columbus. If there's a frustration I have with Columbus and with Ohio State, it's very straightforward. And the first is I don't think most of us appreciate what this city has to offer, number one, and I don't think most of us appreciate what's going on at Ohio State. We haven't done a very good job reminding everybody that this is a very special place, accomplishing things that are critical at a world scale, not just at a city scale. So I think people ought to be a lot happier and prouder of what's going on, both at Ohio State and in Columbus.
You may not know, and I'm going to, this is way off script, but I'm going to do it anyhow. A few years ago, you and I met when I first started at the Metropolitan Club, and I tried out an idea on you that we wanted to develop a class at Ohio State to bring students down to the Metropolitan Club. There is a class now like that. Mindy Wright and Herb Asher did that. So maybe we're going to get that revved up again. It's in the John Glenn School, and we love having the students come down and be part of the Metropolitan Club. So
that's a perfect venue for it.
we're gonna get that going again.
Good.
So I think it took a little bit of a hit because of the switch from quarters to semesters in terms of the timing of getting students down here. But we're real excited about.
So now I'm going to take advantage of that opening. If you ever want to wonder whether a large-scale institution like Ohio State can move quickly, all I ask you to do is look at 2 events, just 2. The first was the combination of 6 colleges, essentially 6 colleges, into one College of the Arts and Sciences, doing that within a 2-year, 3, maybe depending on how you push it, 3-year period, and then moving to semesters. That's the equivalent of a company deciding on a brand new set of products and at the same time changing their entire accounting system and still making a profit throughout that. Not an easy task, and it's done at Ohio State.
Good job. Congratulations. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to have a little extra time for your questions. And if you don't ask them, I'll keep going with the list that I have. So your responsibility now. All right, it's 30 years from now. There's a new president that is settling into Bricker Hall, and he or she is looking through a stack of reports from 2012, 2013, and they see a report that says, that was authored by Joe Alutto. And he says, oh, I remember Joe Alluto. He was the person who...
Writes well.
Okay, you're not going to get off with that short an answer.
No, if there's a legacy, it's literally just that I hope when I do leave Ohio State, I left it as a much better institution than when I joined it. If we all use that as a measure, you just can't go wrong. And so even if it was something as simple as that, I'd be happy.
Very good. Those of you who would like to ask questions, it's a very, very beloved tradition and an important tradition at the Metropolitan Club that we always have time for audience questions. Go to the microphone, introduce yourself, and I would ask in advance, and thank you for not giving us a long story about how you met Woody Hayes or some expression of your opinion. So,
you
go ahead.
appear to be directing that at me specifically.
No, at probably everyone here.
Yes, my name is John McKnight, a member of the Metropolitan Club here, and I work for Rife's Auto Body here in Columbus. We've heard about a lot of wonderful things about the university. We know a lot of wonderful things about the university. Where does it have the most room for improvement? You know, what are some of the issues that we need to focus on where maybe we're falling short? And secondly, as in the interim position, are you able to work on tackling some of those issues, or is it difficult to do that because you know that your time is probably going to be limited, so you don't want to dive into anything too deep?
Well, my time will be limited, but it's never stopped me before. I think if I had to point to one issue with Ohio State, it's that we have invested heavily and successfully in recruiting faculty who generate a lot of data about very significant social problems. And on that regard, I'd put us up against quite literally any university. Where we're not as strong as I think we could be is in the policy application of that. So we know about the information, but then what do you do about it to guide policy, both national policy and international policy? So we're doing some incredible work in the area of food production and safety, for example. What we're missing, I think, is the translation of all of that into the appropriate policy that should be followed at either even a state or national level, but particularly an international level. That's the next step, I think, in the growth of Ohio State and the positioning of it as an institution.
Hi, I'm Bill Lafayette. I'm on the CMC board, owner of Regionomics, and proud PhD graduate of the Fisher College. And my question is, I'm wondering about your vision for economic development, what role the university can and should play in economic development of our state and beyond.
Well, put aside the question that we're a large employer, because that's obviously part of the economic impact we have, but let's put that aside for a moment. One of the traditions of being a land-grant institution is the generation of new information, new knowledge. That's what we do in part with research, but also then the application of that information. And so the whole issue of how do we make sure that this economy benefits from the research that is going on, the intellectual property that's being generated at Ohio State, that has to become a greater emphasis and a greater focus of Ohio State. And I see that continuing. When I look, for example, at what's going on now with fracking and shale oil, there are lots of interesting questions that the university can help answer when it starts to think about the implications of that in order to make that successful. And we are, in fact, beginning to do that. So we're beginning to do, for example, assessments of what happens before you do the fracking so that we have a much better sense then of the consequences, the social consequences, as well as the environmental consequences afterwards. That's something Ohio State can do, and there are very interesting technologies that will emerge from that, having to do with sensors, and that will add to the development of new businesses in Ohio. So there are many activities we're engaged in now. We have to have a much more focused effort on it. But I think the spin-off activities that come from that are just enormous for this state and certainly for this region.
Dr. Alluto, Skylar Burgess with Deloitte. Jane had mentioned globalization. And so I'd like to get your perspective on what Ohio State is doing with its brand to become more global besides just recruiting students here. What are we doing to sort of push our academic excellence beyond our borders?
Let me tell you a story. I came here in 1991, and I was doing a lot of work in Asia and China. And the Alumni Association discovered that, and so they asked me on a trip back from Beijing if I would stop in Seoul to do an alumni reunion, and I did. And so I was having dinner with 20 Korean industrialists who graduated from Ohio State. And they did the first round of toasts, and then the first question came. And the first question was, what is President Gee doing about Mr. Cooper's contract? Now, I found that amazing, and so after the more toasts went on and everybody loosened up a little bit, I said, what in the hell are you doing asking me about the football coach's contract? And their response was fascinating. Their response at that, remember this is 1991, their response was, we love Ohio State, we love Columbus, we had experiences we never thought we'd had, we love the faculty, in fact, we try to keep in touch with some of the faculty, but the way we keep in touch with Ohio State is through the sports section of the International Herald Tribune. And they always carried Big Ten football scores. So one of the things that's happening is we're beginning to take advantage of that. I can't tell you the number of times I've been outside the United States, and the first question that's asked is what's happened in either football or basketball. And it becomes an opening to talk about Ohio State. But we're also putting in place gateways in key areas. So we have gateways now in Shanghai, and we have a gateway in India, Mumbai. There's one that will probably go out into Brazil fairly shortly. And we're using that to push the brand out. So, for example, we're the first university in China to actually run initial orientation programs for students who are coming to the United States, to our campus, in China, in Shanghai and Beijing. That led to incredible publicity in the China Daily and throughout China about an initiative from Ohio State, which had never happened before. So we're trying a number of different mechanisms to get word out about who we are, what we're doing. We have joint programs with universities around the world that are really headlined as Ohio State joint ventures. And all of that is just part of the effort to do exactly what you're describing from a brand perspective. Roger.
First, a comment. Thanks for being the best dean I've ever known. And somebody describes the job of dean or president as best described as herding cats, which is probably true. And after 6 presidents that I've worked for, the trustees wouldn't really have to go any further than the interim president's office to find the best president in the United States, in this country, for this school. But here's my question. One of the things I've sensed in talking to students the last couple of years is a different feeling about the culture of Ohio State. In the past, there seemed to be silos, the business school, ag school, engineering, and there wasn't anything that unified them around Ohio State except athletics, which isn't a huge percentage of the total students involved in that, actually. In the last couple of years, I've heard students saying things about we as the whole university. And I talked to some of the students who said, well, we've studied a book throughout the university with faculty and staff, and some of the people talked about the role of the union, so forth. I don't know just what it is, and that's my question is, how are you establishing in any other dimensions of this Ohio State culture beyond just athletics, of course, which Urban Meyer does fine?
Sure. Well, no, Roger, I think you've actually identified something that really does differentiate Ohio State. Big universities tend to be multiple stacks, multiple silos. What we've been spending a lot of time on is getting students to have common experiences. So yes, Roger, you're right. In fact, all freshman students read the same book, despite everything else they do individually. Those books are discussed. They have common experiences in which we bring them together. The faculty have been absolutely wonderful about interdisciplinary research and institutionalizing that in ways that guarantees there's going to be interaction across the silos of our traditional colleges and departments. It's one of the things that would happen when Gordon was here, we adopted a slogan, the philosophy, if you like, of one university. So we spent a lot of time making sure that we're not duplicating efforts so that each individual college does its own thing and then competes with another individual college. Instead, it's we're one university, how do we leverage what we're doing? And so it really is becoming an operating philosophy for the university, and it shows up with students, as Roger has just described, but from my perspective, just as importantly, it shows up in the behavior of our faculty and staff who begin to understand this is one institution, we're committed to a common set of goals and objectives, and every one of us plays a part, even though for certain purposes we may be out in an individual college or department.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Emmett Kelly with the CMC and also the sponsor today, Frost Brown Todd. Thank you, President Alluto, for being here. You addressed a little earlier on the cost of education. Maybe if you could expand upon that a little more. When I talk to students that want to go to law school or have graduated from law school and now talk about their debt, it's just amazing to me the amount of debt that they have and the perspective that they may have whether they go to a law school or another graduate school and the cost and what they may make coming out. What is the university doing? And it's not just the Ohio State's issue. This is a national and global issue, I know. But maybe just expand on what you said earlier with respect to what you're doing with the endowment dollars. But I assume there's also got to be a different philosophy how we move forward and pay for the cost of education.
Thank you. Actually, this is a very complicated issue, and I'm going to try to answer it at different levels. At the university level, we certainly are paying attention to what can we do to reduce costs. In fact, we spend a lot of our time and our effort on cost savings, and we're estimating cost savings based on our planning, at least, over the next 4 to 5 years in the $100 million range. We've already saved over $100 million in just cost reductions. So part of it is how do we contain our costs? How do we become more efficient in what we do? Part of it is the fact that now, today, students have multiple choices about where they can take courses. They come to us with advanced placement credits, they do dual enrollments, they do a variety of things which wind up reducing the cost that they have to actually incur. There's a little piece which I do want to mention because I think it's very important, and that's to teach students to become more financially savvy. One of the issues for students is they're incurring debts they don't need. They're using funds for a variety of purposes other than college, but borrowing against their borrowing capacity to do that. So we spend a lot of time on financial education with freshmen and sophomores on campus through student life. I see John here today, Dr. J. That's a very important part of this issue of how do you get them to manage. The other is you're ultimately, particularly beyond the undergraduate level, you want people to be rational about their decision making. And let me use law as an example. If you're going to go into debt for $150,000 to go to law school, the question you have to ask yourself ultimately is it worth it? If it's passion, that's what's driving you, then maybe the $150,000 is worth it. If you think you're going to recoup that within the first or second year, and unless you're in one of the better places like Moritz, it isn't going to happen. So I think part of it is getting people to behave in a fairly rational fashion about what they expect as outcomes. We struggle with a number of things. So I'll use social work as an example. Very important set of skills that we need from society. I worry about students who go into that kind of an area, live frugally, do all the right things, and then still come out with debt. Those are the students I worry about. I'm a little less worried about a student who makes a vocational decision to go into an area, and then that's a choice they make. So we're struggling with that question of how do we deal with areas of study that we think are critical to society, and how do we manage that debt in a reasonable fashion? So it's a little bit of an institutional response, a little bit of a sense of individuals have to take responsibility for the decisions that they make.
I'm going to take advantage of the last couple minutes to, the discovery themes are something that Dr. Gee helped create as part of the strategy. And, you know, there's a thread here in terms of those discovery themes crossing many of the colleges within the university also creating valuable policy that goes out. Tie those together for me, please.
Well, we're expecting in each of the discovery themes the focus that takes place within the discovery theme.
And maybe we need to tell people what those are.
And those are health and wellness, food production and safety, and then there's an energy and sustainability focus to that as well. And a lot of that is going to be the discovery of new knowledge. But as a part of it, and as part of the commitment to those areas, is a concern for people who will help us then develop policy based on the empirical evidence that's developed through research. So it's built into the notion of our discovery themes. The point that I think is often missed is that the discovery themes, while the focus is on research and the focus is on generating new information and then discovering policy, it's also focused heavily on the educational programs. Those discovery themes should be ultimately the primary reasons why students come to Ohio State, because there are programs underneath there that will prepare them effectively to pursue their own lives, focusing on one of those areas, whether it's production of food and safety or other issues. And so connecting the research that goes on in those programs, the policy development that goes on in those programs, and then the educational academic programs that support them is going to be the big thing, I think, that will make Ohio State significantly different than many other institutions who are trying to do work in the same areas.
So the search committee now has identified a new candidate, and you have an opportunity to interview that person. What is important to ask them before they're offered the job?
You have to have a sense of their passion. Are they really committed to discovery, to worrying about then the development of what do you do with the discovery? Are they really committed to helping students pursue their own lives and careers and develop above and beyond what they think is possible? It takes a variety of skills, a variety of passions, and they can have individual passions, but that's not what it takes to run an institution as complex as Ohio State. It's not what has happened in the past with the successful presidents we have. So I would certainly look for that mix of commitments on the part of any candidate.
It's been an honor. Thank you, and a pleasure to have you here.
It's been fun. Thank you.